Equal Education is also urging the Department of Basic Education to push against further reductions of its allocated budget from National Treasury. Despite the increase in school enrollment, austerity policies, have reduced government spending on basic education. Just last year, for instance, over 2 billion rand was cut from the department, and that led to the deterioration of school infrastructure, amongst many other things. So let's get you an idea of what the education sector is expecting from the budget policy statement today. Equal Education's researcher Jane Bowman is our guest, joining us now via our video link. And Jane, it's great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for making time to chat to us. So, you know, the Basic Education Department, for as long as I can remember, has always decried just how much it doesn't have enough money from National Treasury. However, we've also come to learn that the money that is there is not being well spent. How do you reckon the minister should negotiate these two things?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me on. I think it is very, very difficult. I don't think that it's not simply as easy as throwing more money at basic education, because we do have those issues of underspending, we have issues of irregular expenditure. However, there's also a role for National Treasury to play in oversight of expenditure, and we think that that is something that we are really, really wanting to push for. But at the end of the day, the solution has to be two-pronged. Basic education needs to have enough funding to be able to provide all learners with the base minimum requirements to be able to get a basic education. But we also need to focus on looking at how that money is spent and building state capacity. So it is a complex problem, and I think both have to be done at the same time.
How do we get that right, though? I get a sense we're speaking very much in broad strokes, and I wonder, for instance, if after the budget policy statement today, whether anybody would be any clearer about how we solve that quagmire.
Exactly, and I think what is really important to keep in mind, and what is, you know, the baseline, sort of the base thing that Equal Education is fighting for, is we still haven't seen some schools get the basic minimum requirements. That's water, that's sanitation, that's safe school structures, that's making sure there's no pit latrines at school. And so we're not even dealing with things like laboratories or libraries, which are also actually part of the minimum norms and standards. We're dealing with very, very, very basic things that all schools should have. So I think in that case, it really has to be, firstly, an instance of political will. I mean, we saw with COVID-19 how quickly the Department of Basic Education was able to roll out temporary water tankers, temporary sanitation. So I think perhaps they're along with making sure that the policies are properly implemented, the money is properly spent, there needs to be a recognition again that basic education is fundamental to our society, it's fundamental to all learners, and it needs to be a top priority for both government and obviously for school infrastructure for the Department of Basic Education.
Yeah. So the Budget Justice Coalition, of which Equal Education is a member, has actually done some research in the lead up to today. You've noted several things that you reckon ought to be considered when Inokonawana speaks today. But speak to us about, I guess, the role that other stakeholders ought to be playing here. It's not just about Treasury and the Basic Education Department here.
Exactly. And one thing that we really wanted to point out in the paper is that there is a very, very vital role for civil society to play, for schools to play, for teachers to play, even for learners and for communities to play in making sure that that the Department of Basic Education and provincial education departments deliver on their promises. I think one of the main things is understanding what the role of provincial education departments is, understanding learners' rights, and being able to make sure and challenge provincial education departments when these service deliveries aren't provided. And so I think that there's a big, big role for civil society to play in holding government accountable, but also raising media awareness about what's happening. And I think that, you know, we have seen MBCs for Education respond very quickly when there's a public outcry around issues with spending in the department. So there definitely is a very, very big role for civil society to play.
Yeah. Outside of creating an uproar when we realize that money is not being spent correctly, outside of taking implicated officials to court when we realize that money isn't being spent correctly, structurally, in what ways can, for instance, Treasury implement mechanisms to ensure that the money goes where it needs to go? Because I imagine that's really where the rubber hits the road here. You can't just throw money into a hole without necessarily being able to guarantee that whoever's in charge of that money spends it correctly.
Exactly. And I think there are a number of things, because obviously when we're talking about budget cuts, we're not just talking about cuts to infrastructure grants or cuts to, say, the National School Nutrition Program. We're also talking about cuts to staff and capacity within the departments of basic education and provincial education departments. And so one of the big things is to make sure that National Treasury is not undercutting the ability of the PEDs and Department of Basic Education to actually properly hire, properly train staff to be able to implement the other policies that are coming into effect. And an example of this is the fact that wasteful expenditure, which is when there wasn't really any nefarious activity, it was actually just badly spent, amounts to a substantial amount of money wasted every year. And that really could be solved by making sure that there's proper capacity within the departments to plan and implement these projects. And part of that is having the funding to hire people, having the funding to make sure that wages are increased in order to keep people in that sector. So there is a role there for building capacity through funding in the Department of Basic Education and provincial education departments.
The issues around education are always so complex. Let's get a sense of how the Minister deals with it when he speaks later today at 2 p.m. For now, thank you very much indeed for your time and for weighing in on what the sector thinks is important in the lead up to that moment. Jane Bowman is a researcher with Equal Education. Once again, Jane, thanks very much indeed.